How do you follow that? You ready for another story? Let's look into the word this morning. In the first session, we were in 2 Peter. Now we're going to flip back to 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2. In the first session, we were in 2 Peter chapter 2. Now we're in 1 Peter chapter 2. And we're going to focus like a laser on verse 20 and 21. The context here is slaves sometimes suffering without cause, sometimes with cause. Peter says in verse 20, "But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps." Leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. I want to talk to you today for just a few moments about following in his steps. When you were a child, did you ever play the game, Follow the Leader? Now, I did, and I can remember as maybe a 10-year-old boy, my brother and me and some of the other kids in the neighborhood, we played an extreme version of Follow the Leader. Some of y'all would have never made it back in that day. I mean, we did crazy stuff. Steve and Frank talked about thorns and things being introduced into the world, and we had them right in our backyard. My dad was a farmer of sorts. He had been a farmer in Germany, and in our backyard we had 10 different things growing. He even tried to grow potatoes in the backyard. That didn't do really well. And we had a corner of the yard that was crabapple trees with thorns in them, and when we played Follow the Leader, if there were kids who didn't know the terrain, I would take them crawling underneath, and I knew the path just to get down low enough, and they'd come out of there all scratched up with thorns and stuff. And then after that, if some were still following, we'd climb up a garage and go over the roof of the garage and drop down on the other side. And if I hadn't lost everybody by that time, I'd be walking across a skinny little fence. I'm like, what can I possibly do to shake these people off my tail? Now, Peter here is writing about following in the steps of Jesus, that he is an example that we might follow in his steps. The word in verse 21 that says that we have an example. Excuse me, the Greek here is hupogrammos. We get our word grammar from this word. And that was like a handwriting sketch that children would learn how to read with. They would have the letters that they would make, and they would copy them exactly. So what Peter is saying here, you have an example of Jesus not teaching you how to read, but here's an example of Jesus teaching you how to live. And the Apostle Paul, in Romans chapter 8 and verse 29, he says that we are predestined to be conformed to the likeness of his Son. Same idea here. We're following him. We're trying to do stuff just exactly like he did. We're trying to fit into the mold that was Jesus Christ. We're trying to speak the way that he spoke, love the way that he loved, forgive the way that he did. And if we're doing this, if we're conforming that, then we will be following him and walking in his steps. Now, I already gave you one assignment today to read Numbers chapter 22, and that might be enough if you run out of material there. If you read the Gospels, the first few chapters of each Gospel, you get an idea of Jesus calling the disciples and them following him. And John starts in a way that is different than the other three. Matthew, Mark, and Luke start in Galilee, where they're calling the disciples in Galilee. John starts in Judea, in the area of Jerusalem, where John the Baptist is baptizing people. And Andrew, who was one of the Jesus' 12 disciples, and John had previously been disciples of John the Baptist. And it says that John was baptizing people on the other side of Jordan at a place called Bethany. And Jesus comes to be baptized in the Jordan River, and God speaks out of heaven and said, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." And the next day, John the Baptist and Andrew and John are standing there talking. And John the Baptist says, "Behold, the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world." And you know what it says they did? They said, "Well, forget you, John." Well, they didn't actually say that, but they essentially did. And they started following Jesus. And as Jesus was walking down the road, Andrew and John were following him at a distance. Have you ever felt that someone was following you and you could kind of sense it, and you turned around and looked at him and stared him down, and they stopped when you stopped and they started when that's kind of creepy, isn't it? Well, Andrew and John were following Jesus, and finally he turned around and said, "What do you want?" And they said, "Well, we want to know where you're staying." And Jesus said, "Come and see." And John goes on to tell us in chapter 1 of John that it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So it was getting late. So they came to him and he taught them basically the whole night. And they ended up staying with him for a whole day. And the next day, Jesus gets up. He says, "I'm going to Galilee." But before he went to Galilee, guess who he met? He met Simon Peter. Well, actually, his name at that time was Simon. That's what it was, Simon. Simon, son of John, or called Simon Bar-Jonah. And John and Andrew, who had been with Jesus that first night, it says Andrew introduced Peter to Jesus. You know what Jesus did? He looked him right in the eyes and he said, "Hey, you're going to be Peter," or Cephas. Jesus loved to give nicknames out. He looked at James and John one day and he said, "You guys are going to be called the sons of thunder." I wonder what nickname he would have given me. He had nicknames for many, many people. And when we look at the list of the apostles that he called, there was Matthew and Thomas and James, son of Alphaeus. But Matthew is also the son of Alphaeus. Probably they had the same dad. It doesn't say that, but there's a good chance of that. My name is Edwin. My brother's name is Walter. And I've never heard those two names in context before. And then last week, Pastor Gordon was talking about having gone to a Walter Hawkins concert. And I thought, yeah, that's the first time I've ever heard of that combination, because Walter Hawkins, the gospel singer, has a brother named Edwin Hawkins. So here's a Walter Hawkins and Edwin Hawkins. And what if their dad was what if they both had a dad named Rudy, like my brother and me did? You'd think we could probably pin it down. I'm guessing that Matthew, son of Alphaeus, was probably the brother of James, the son of Alphaeus, who was like one of the lower tiered guys. There were two James that were apostles. There was also two Simons. There was Simon the Zealot, and there was Simon Peter, and maybe that's why Jesus changed his name to Peter, to avoid the confusion. And then there was Thomas, whose nickname was Didymus, also known as the twin. And church history tells us that he looked just like Jesus did. And it kind of put him in a dangerous position because there were a lot of people looking to kill Jesus, especially around the time of Lazarus being raised from the dead. Not only did they seek to kill Jesus, but they sought to kill Lazarus as well. And so it was dangerous for Thomas to walk around looking like Jesus as his twin, if that was the case. But when we read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the way that Jesus called the disciples, if you would not read the account in John, you would think that Jesus just one day walked onto Peter's boat and started teaching there. Well, actually, he had already met Peter because Andrew had introduced him way back in Judea, kind of warming him up, but he hadn't become a follower yet. He had only become an acquaintance. And so Jesus gets on Peter's boat and he says, "Hey, Peter, launch this boat out into the deep part of the lake and you'll catch fish." And Peter said, "Well, we've been fishing all day, haven't caught a thing. But because you said it, I'm going to do it." And so Peter puts the nets out, and they were so full, they had to signal James and John, who were their partners, the sons of Zebedee, and they helped them pull these nets to the shore that were laden with so many fish they couldn't handle it. And Peter was exasperated with himself for having doubted the Lord. And he said, "Lord, depart from me, I'm a wicked man." And from that moment on, he followed Jesus. He didn't follow him in Judea. He was acquainted with him. But here he really dived in and became a hardcore follower of Jesus Christ, as many of the other apostles did too. What does it mean to follow? Well, many rabbis in the time of Jesus had followers, and they would walk around in single file, and everybody knew who the main guy was. They knew who the teaching rabbi was, and from the greatest to the least in seniority, they would follow him. The word follow today doesn't mean what it meant back then. The word follow today is most commonly used if you're following somebody on X, formerly Twitter, or on some other platform. You're following somebody. It's a casual thing, like, "Oh yeah, I follow him." Means I occasionally read what he or she wrote. I'm aware of them. Yeah, I'm going to follow up on that. I'll touch base with you. It's not like I'm right on his heels. I'm following him every day. 168 hours in a week, I think it is, and the average Christian in the United States feels if they've given him 1 or 2 hours on a Sunday, they've really followed up. But Jesus said in Matthew 16, verse 24, he said, "If any man would be my disciple, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." He's talking about carrying his cross, the crossbeam of the cross on the road up to Golgotha, and it's a metaphorical expression of you're going to experience difficulty in the life of being a Christian. And Peter explained this in our text today, where he said, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. We're trying to conform to the image of Christ here. We're trying to change the way we do things and quit our own ideas and follow his ideas, but sometimes socially and sometimes even physically, it could create problems for us in this life. And so I've got to ask you, are you ready to follow Jesus? Because the world would have you deny Jesus. There's a book out entitled Unmasking the Chaldean Spirits, written by a former Israeli rabbi, Zev Porat. Zev Porat was a high-ranking rabbi in Israel just a few years ago when he was presented with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And guess what? Just like Peter, and just like Matthew and James and John, he believed. And the price that he had to pay was very high. He lost his position as a rabbi in Israel and even as a member of the Sanhedrin court. He lost his position, and in just a few years, he and his wife were homeless. They had nothing. Their family cut them off. They were living on the street. They paid a heavy price for following Jesus Christ. And then one day, Zev Porat got a notice that his grandfather had died. And his grandfather's lawyer got a hold of him and asked him to come into the office, and sat him down in the office and said, Zev, I've got really good news for you. You're basically the only heir that your grandfather had left at this point in time, and he's left all his money to you. And Zev was aghast when he said he has left you $41 million. As we were driving to church this morning, I saw that sign that has those red numbers on it listing the Powerball jackpot and the Mega Bucks jackpot, and I'm not going to win because I don't buy those tickets. But it was like $568 million or something like that. Well, once you've got 41 million or 568, it doesn't really matter. You can buy whatever you want. You've got a lot of money. And so the attorney said, good news, you have inherited $41 million, but your grandfather, who also was a rabbi, has one little thing here. All you have to do is renounce Jesus Christ. All you have to do. Just sign off that you renounce Christ, and the 41 million is yours. And Zev said, no, I can't do that. I know 41 million is a lot, but I can't renounce Christ. And the lawyer says, here's the pen, you just sign it, and we won't tell anybody. And Lev said, no, I'll know in my heart that I've renounced Christ, then I will not do that. Keep your $41 million. And so I think it was donated to some zoo or something like that. And the thing is, right after that, he and his wife started being blessed just out of nowhere, being blessed financially and being blessed in many, many ways. Without the $41 million, now he's a well-known published author selling a lot of books, and we don't know what's going to happen when we follow Jesus in his steps. Every step he takes, we take a step with him. Peter wrote this. While he wrote this, I wonder if he was remembering the words of Jesus to him in John chapter 21. after Jesus had restored him, after Peter's betrayal of Jesus, Jesus said to him, Peter, when you're old, somebody else will stretch out your hands and lead you where you do not want to go. And Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death that Peter would glorify God with. In other words, he indicated that Peter would be crucified, as was a common method of killing somebody in that day. And my question to you today is, if you're following Jesus, are you being conformed to his image? Or as the apostle Paul put it in 2 Corinthians 3, that we reflect the Lord's glory and are being transformed into his likeness with ever increasing glory. See, transformation, being transformed, is even something different than being conformed. Conformed means we're doing what he did, we're saying what he did, but being transformed means our very nature, our very character, our very function, our very life is changed from the inside out. We're made something new from deep within. It goes beyond being conformed, but we're actually changed. And in 1 John chapter 3, John wrote, Beloved, now are we the sons of God, and it does not yet appear what we shall be, what we know, that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. You know what he's saying here? You may not quite be like Jesus yet, but if you're following in his steps, when he appears, you as the Son of God, you're going to be changed. You're going to be glorified. You're going to be even more like him. Maybe you look at yourself now and then and say, oh man, you are pitiful. Do you ever say that to yourself? You're pitiful. You are sorry excuse. How many of you talk to yourself? Do you ever say, I can't believe I did that? I'm like, I'm this old and I'm still doing that. And sometimes we get disgusted with ourselves, and sometimes we say that, you might say that to your spouse or whatever. But this following business is a tough business. Sister Maria Barreto sitting there, she's from Bronx, New York City. And I used to have friends lived in the Bronx, and we had where I grew up in Milford, Connecticut, we had a sister church in Brooklyn, New York City. And we would drive into Brooklyn and have joint meetings with them. Sometimes they would come down into Connecticut and meet with us. And Brooklyn was always a scary place to be, Sister Maria. It was like, all right, one time, it was like late at night, we had been in a watch night service on New Year's Eve, and we had driven through Times Square. Where's Times Square? Is that in the Bronx or is that in Manhattan? Where? Manhattan? Yeah, well, we had driven through Manhattan after all the revelers had left, and there was debris like 6 inches deep. You couldn't see the pavement. It was just junk, litter, and everything. And we were following, the car I was in, we were following somebody. Here it's like 2 o'clock in the morning in Brooklyn. We don't have a map. We don't know where we're going. And the guy we're following wasn't paying any attention to us. And I'm like, stay close. And they lagged back. And drivers in New York City are crazy. They're nuts. Like when the light turns red, people won't stop. They'll go for a while. And somebody finally from the other side pushes out and they'll go for a while. It's like madness. So we got caught at a light. And the person we're following is long gone, and we don't have a map. And I can remember riding around in this dark city, this dark, dangerous place that I'd had a friend who got pulled over in Brooklyn one time, and he's like, what'd I do, officer? officer said, "You stopped at that stop sign. Don't you ever stop at a stop sign here in the middle of the night. Don't ever do it. You're going to get held up or whatever." And it's like, "Yes, sir, thank you." And he went on. I'm remembering these stories I've heard, and we're out there in the middle of the night. Got nobody to follow, and we drove around. We finally found the main road, and it was a miracle that we ever got home. Andrew and John were following Jesus, and he turns around and says, "What do you want?" And they said, "Where are you staying?" He says, "Come and see." So if you're following Jesus today, just imagine he's turning around. He's saying, "Come on and see." He's got a lot of stuff he wants to lead you to if you will walk in his steps. Peter's saying he's the example, the perfect example. Would you walk in his steps today? I wonder if we could bow our heads in prayer today, and I'm going to pray that we can accept this teaching today. Father, I pray that you would help us today to be able to walk in your steps. Lord, sometimes we get our own mind. We're not very good at following the leader. And sometimes when you're going over the roof of a garage in our life and we find it difficult to follow you, Lord, help us to keep our eyes on you, that we would follow the leader like your disciples did. And they didn't always get it right, and we don't get it right so many times. But Lord, help us to follow your example, that we could learn these things. I pray that you would be with us today, throughout this day, as we spend it with you and with family and with friends. Bless us this day as we follow you. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you. Have a great day in Jesus.